thinking that we could only have 12 people in the room at a time. And that was the number for last year, but we have new information and we've bumped it up to 18.
Oh.
So that's nice because we won't have to tell folks who are visiting that they're not, that they have to go outside and turn on their devices in order to see what we're doing. And we'll be able to have witnesses in the witness chair. And
If we don't want somebody here, can we just say that we're at 12?
We've got 18 and we're stuck with now that we've made that decision. And, of course, we want people to be here, but I think it would be good just for when we do have people who are visiting who haven't been in the room before to let them know who we are. And then we'll ask them if they're willing to do so to just tell us who they are. So I'm David Durfee. I'm chair of the committee, and I represent the Bennington 3 district, which is Shaftesbury, Sunderland, and Glastonbury. And we can just go around the table and why don't you go next?
I'm Rodney Graham. I represent Orange 3 district, which is down at Williamstown and Chelsea, Central Vermont area.
Yeah, I'm Jed Lipsky, Lamoille District 1, represents Stowe.
Henry Pearl, Caledonia, Washington District, and that's Danville, Peacham, and Cabot.
Charles Wilson, I represent Caledonia 3, which is Linden, Sheffield, Wheelock, Sutton, and Norfolk.
And I'm David Templeman, a representative of Orleans 3, which is Brownington, Barton, and Westmore, including Orleans Village.
I was like, you were saying, including Orleans Village. Josie Levitt, Grandal Chittenden, which is, I'm not going to say all the towns, all of Grandal County and a little sliver of West Milton.
Mike Rice, Bennington, Rutland District, Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru.
Don O'Brien, Windsor Orange 1, that's Royalton in my hometown of Tunbridge.
And I'm Esme Cole. I represent Windsor 6, which includes Hartford, Vermont.
Heather Supernaut, Vice Chair. I represent Windsor 4, which is Barnard, Bridgewater, and Pontefract.
And like,
I'm Meg, I work with Action Circles, and my client is the Conservation Districts.
good, nice to have you with us.
I'm Amber Perry with Vermont Farm Bureau.
Well, welcome to the committee. And we don't have anyone on Zoom. I guess maybe that's something that we should be just confirming from time to time, but nobody is nobody is, I think, joining us on Zoom at the moment. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Somebody had asked earlier about eating in here, if it was okay to eat in this room, and the answer is yes. If you can't find a spot in the cafeteria, for example, at lunch, which seems to be a likely situation, and you want to come up here, feel free. And I think maybe when we're actually meeting, we probably shouldn't be eating at the same time, but feel free to bring your breakfast or lunch up and for sure. The other thing I wanted to mention was, and this is something to be thinking about, we've got 13, I think, total committees in the House this year, and including ours. So we almost have a 1-to-1 ratio of committee members to other committees. And typically what committees do is have a liaison to the other committees so that we collectively can have a sense of what's happening at some level anyway in the other rooms. So we could talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but it wouldn't be going to their meetings. In the past, it would not have been watching their meetings after the fact because that wasn't an option. I guess it could include that now, but more just sort of checking out the agenda, keeping an eye on how legislation is moving forward, and particularly to the extent that it might be related to work that we're doing. So there will often be bills that are in another committee that are gonna come here later, or bills that happen here that are moved on to other committees. So be thinking, if you want, about what other committee you might be interested in sort of keeping tabs on. And we can, revisit this question in a couple of days after people have had a chance to give it some thought. And feel free to discuss it among yourselves too, if you want to do that. And is that something that happened in the past? Did the committee have a liaison?
No.
Yeah, okay.
Particularly.
Liaison to the money committees usually, right?
Yeah, okay.
Question, Dan?
Yes.
There formerly was a Natural Resources Committee which has disappeared. Do you know where those responsibilities, because that included forest parks, recreation, and some regulation, what committee have those responsibilities sort of been blended to?
Yeah, I think the short answer is the Environment and Energy Committee, the new Environment and Energy Committee. And it may not be 100% lining up, because I know that there are multiple instances of jurisdiction areas shifting slightly. And I'm not sure that they all are in that committee, but for the most part. Yeah. And our jurisdiction includes forest parks and recreation. So we'll be hearing from somebody later this week. Yeah. Good. All right. So what I wanted to do this afternoon, and we're gonna take some time now just to hear from you all about what your interests are and what might be on your wish list of things to try and accomplish this session. We have the afternoon. We do have our legislative council coming in later this afternoon to give us an update on what the committee did last year, more or less. And I think he's not available till 3. So if we don't necessarily need to have this conversation go on until 3, we'll talk until they're done talking, and then we can take a break, and then we'll come back and have that later today. The schedule, just briefly for the rest of the week, we've got some time tomorrow morning. I think we're going to have a quick security briefing, and then a representative or two from the food bank will be coming in to give us an introduction to the work that they do. So this committee has the jurisdiction of this committee has also changed somewhat from last year. So what we want to do is get familiar really with what the food bank does and how it might involve, to the extent that it does, local production and agriculture. We certainly are interested in that. We had intended to have the folks from the Agency of Agriculture in tomorrow afternoon. They had to reschedule because Senator Welch, our new senator, is visiting St. Albans and going to be talking about the Farm Bill, the federal Farm Bill. So they had to bow out of visiting with us tomorrow. So we've got an open slot. I don't know that we're going to have anything going on, just so you can be thinking ahead for tomorrow's schedule. We may be done in the committee in the morning, and then the floor tomorrow meets at 3. And then we've got, I won't go into detail on the rest of the week, but just wanted you to know that tomorrow we will have that open block, I think, after lunch. Good. Representative O'Brien.
Does this new title with food resiliency in there, is there a different jurisdiction with that, or is it just a sort of different way of thinking about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a different jurisdiction as well. So we may see bills that are coming in the morning or in the afternoon when the speaker gets a bill and reads it out loud and says where it's going to go. We may get bills that we wouldn't have had before. I'm not sure that it's going to be entirely the case that any bill dealing with food comes to us necessarily. So food resiliency doesn't necessarily mean, food in general. But yeah, I think bills will be spending more time in the committee, whether or not they're directed here first thing or not. That also reminds me that I just wanted to say, especially for the newer members, I think there have been 35 bills introduced so far, and if you're listening carefully, you have noticed none of them were assigned to our committee, and that doesn't mean anything necessarily. They come out in the order that they're signed off on, that they're written, and that they're finalized. So when there are bills that come into this committee, they will go up on the board there, and then we'll begin to have a chance to take testimony on those bills. And in the meantime, before that happens, we will use the time that we do have to hear from, I hope, a wide variety of people in the various areas of our jurisdiction. So as I mentioned, the food bank just happens to be one that we'll be doing tomorrow. We will be hearing later in the week from the Ag Agency. We'll be hearing later in the week from Forests. Not sure who that is, but anyway, we'll use this time to just sort of let's all learn about the work of these various branches of government. So good. All right. Well. Let's go around this way. Representative Superintendent, if you want to kick us off, what are your thoughts? What are your aspirations and wishes, dreams for the year for the committee?
So many, really, actually. But I will tell you that some of the conversations that I have been involved with this summer with folks from farmers, from other ag stakeholders, from other representatives. Representative O'Brien was part of these conversations with me, and please feel free to chime in. One of the pieces of potential legislation that I want to chat with you all about right now is the Payment for Ecosystem Services and Healthy Soils Act. And I am just going to give a very brief level overview of this. And if folks aren't familiar with what Payment for Ecosystem Services even means, I'm happy to give a very gentle, detailed description, but also keep in mind that Payment for Ecosystem Services are flexible and that those definitions are still being created. So what this potential piece of policy is looking to do is address climate change and ensure the viability of our Vermont farms. And this potential legislation hopes to create a streamlined onboarding system for funding for farmers, and it explores how that funding intersects with resilient stewardship practices. So this bill had originally been essentially created within the conservation districts, and they would be the dominant avenue to implement this work on the ground. So for a little bit of background information, since 2019, the legislatively mandated Payment for Ecosystem Services and Soil Health Working Group explored ecosystem services and ways to measure them and what incentives already exist and what farmers need to be more viable when they're adopting those conservation practices. So ultimately, what we want to do in this bill is, instead of reinventing the wheel and creating an entirely new model for what Payment for Ecosystem Services is, the goal of this legislation is to work within and improve already existing programs, which we love because not adding on more burdens to folks to create new programs is important. And as it stands, existing direct and indirect incentives are predominantly practice-based approaches, whereas the difference in this legislation is it would explore what it means to measure and administer outcome-based programs that could evaluate tangibly the ecosystem services that farms generate. So instead of saying, all right, you're going to be awarded for something that you're implementing, you'll be awarded for these outcomes that we're seeing having a really positive impact on climate change mitigation. And what this bill hopes to do is to shy away from narrowing our focus and measuring a single outcome or ecosystem service that could be very short-sighted and limit all the ways that farmers contribute to mitigation. And then the second part of this bill, which is still being worked through, is the idea to drastically improve the interface of agricultural programming by investing in streamlining the access to existing programs through a single online platform. And the conservation districts are already doing the work to help farmers get state and federal funding. So instead of having to go through multiple service providers, which farmers don't have the time to do that, and often aren't even aware of the funding that exists for them, this would address those shortfalls in the existing programmings. And yeah, ultimately, you would have just one group, that being the conservation districts, who could help farmers remain viable, help them address all of their stewardship needs. So that is something that is still really being worked on, but I think is something that I'm really excited about as a potential piece of policy. Yeah.
Can we ask questions?
I think we could have a limited amount of questions. Yes.
Could you give an example of a service that's already in action that I mean, you mentioned that this would be applied to programs that are already happening. Could you give an example of one of those?
Of like the consolidation of services?
I'm sorry, the payment for ecosystem service paradigm. You mentioned that these services are already in place. These are things that are already in program. Can you name one?
I think I'm still missing your question.
Maybe I misunderstood what you were saying.
Yeah. However, if I may though, Meg is exceptionally familiar with this. Understanding this question in a way that I'm missing.
I think I understand your question.
Hold on 1 second. Sorry. I just want to, don't mean to cut you off and do want to hear what you have to say. Want to be sure that when we have witness testimony that folks are in the chair and so what I'm going to do, if you don't mind, I'm going to reconsider my response to but looking forward to a healthy back and forth on the topic, but maybe we should go around and hear from everybody first, and then we'll definitely open it up to those discussions. And I hope your schedule allows you to stay for okay. All right, great. Thanks. Were you all set then?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. And Representative Cole, I turn to you then if you'd like to.
Okay. Well, definitely lots to think about. And these are a few priorities that I have now in this moment, but I know that there are going to be tons and tons that come up throughout time, because I'm going to learn a lot through each of you. One thing that is top of mind, which ties directly to Representative Supernut's point here, is making our local and small scale farms economically competitive, of course, because we don't have that advantage of economies of scale. And so somehow supplementing like the viability of their practices, and not only on the side of their being able to thrive and stay in business and be successful, but also on the consumption side, making it affordable for folks to buy locally produced produce or whatever good is available. And part of that might include facilitating more contracts between locally sourced food with larger institutions such as schools, which is a big one, hospitals, another big one, and then one that people may not think quite as much about, but prisons as well, because there's a lot of, Cisco and other giant corporations, that's usually, I think they go through those, but I think it could be a benefit to both the farmers' economic viability as well as just promoting a healthier Vermont in whole. Universal school meals, I know, is one that we're going to talk about more, and that interests me quite a bit. And I could go on a little bit more about that, but maybe I'll just go through here. Another one quite important to me is offering safe and of decent quality residential spaces for on-site farm workers who are going to live and work at the same place, especially for those who might not be able to advocate for themselves in these situations, like undocumented folks who support our farms in Vermont, because there are quite a few. A last point I think I'll share, which I'm not entirely sure how it ties into this committee, but perhaps it does, is working on our compost infrastructure here, because it was recently enacted into law that all Vermonters must compost food waste. And it's a rule, and obviously not everyone abides by that rule, which is too bad, but it's also realistic. I think given that the state hasn't necessarily provided infrastructure to make it happen, we rely on private entities to offer services related to composting. And so thinking about what the state's rule or role could be, given that we are obligating it to happen here. Great, those are a few of my starting ideas, but also I'm just so excited to learn more about all of your priorities. And yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Representative O'Brien.
Well, maybe revisiting some of the things from previous terms. I mean, it's interesting, both PES and composting tie into, one thing we've learned in the past was that we're sort of like, in a lot of ways, we're kind of the soil state of the country as far as what we're doing with soil, like regenerative farming. And we're sort of way ahead, according to UVM Extension and other people that are working every day in this. It'd be interesting to see how far we can go with that. I don't know, legislation-wise what that looks like, but certainly something there. Last year, homesteading came up and micro farming's come up here, and so we didn't have time last year to really get to it, but we sort of thought, let's look into homesteading, because there's so much of backyard farming going on here that it's, economically it's kind of a big deal. Food resiliency wise, it's a big deal, but it doesn't really, I don't think, get much time at the Agency of Agriculture, for example, because everybody's below, they're sort of either in small farm scale. Then things like dairy, the Dairy Task Force is, dairy sort of, it's interesting that on the Dairy Task Force we talked a lot with Maine because we're thinking of a program similar to theirs as far as a tiered payment thing, but in Maine, the dairy is about the equivalent of potatoes, I think, in Maine, so pretty big deal. And then I was like, well, what about lobster? And they're like, lobster's so far ahead of everything else as far as an agricultural sort of commodity. And if that's in Vermont, milk is our lobster. I think it's so far ahead of everybody else that it's the 800-pound gorilla. Other things we've talked about in the past, but never even had sort of briefings on, silviculture was one. I think equine and horses is a really big deal, but never sort of makes it either into the agency or this room. Sugaring is a big deal, but we haven't done any bills on it. It's interesting that with maple trees, sugaring is at the Agency of Agriculture. Maples for lumber is at Forest Parks and Rec, so they sort of divide the forest that way. We've done a lot with pollinators and pesticides, but I think there's a lot more to be done there too. And then lastly, there are all these oddball things that keep coming up, like crocuses for saffron. It'd be interesting to explore if Vermont's climate or our experience, our agriculturally or our forest economy, if there's anything here that would make Vermont essentially like the captive insurance of agriculture or forestry, because there's so many things like hemp, cannabis, right, crocuses, but there are hops that can grow here, but I don't think we're unique to anywhere else often in the country. So like hemp, you can grow hemp really well in other places. Cannabis, same thing. Hops, same thing. But does our climate or what grows here, like maple trees, really lend itself to some sort of new of agriculture that we could incentivize.
Great. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. A few of the things that have already been talked about are priorities for me. I think with PES, it's really exciting, and I think it's exciting. It's really important that we make sure that we're not missing the opportunity that we have to really center what farmers actually need out of a program like this, and not to look back in 20 years if we are actually able to get something done and say, oh, we really missed the vote on that one, and it wasn't as helpful as it could have been either to climate mitigation or to farmers. With pollinators, I think that's one of the more exciting areas of this new food resiliency jurisdiction for me in this committee, because pollinator protection and pollinator habitat protection is a huge food resiliency issue. And so whether it's in sort of building and focusing on building habitat and preserving habitat, or in protecting pollinators through pesticide reduction, I think both those things really fall under that food resiliency, in addition to sort of where they fall in as they've more traditionally fallen under agriculture. And PFAS also sort of like really touches on the food resiliency piece, among other things, and really making sure, I think, identifying it as a regional problem. I think a lot of people are afraid to even talk about it because you don't want it to be seen as a problem with Vermont farms, right? You don't want PFAS to suddenly be the Vermont dairy problem, or the Vermont, and I've heard similar things expressed in Massachusetts. Maine is really out in front of it because they just sort of had to be with some of the contamination that was discovered, but just making sure that we're working regionally and we're all sort of doing what we can to come together and say, this is an everybody problem and we have to address it, and not sort of getting stuck in not wanting to talk about it because we're afraid of the ramifications. And since you mentioned oddballs and things that are potentially places of growth in our changing climate, grapes are, something that people over the last 10 years have been growing much more obviously in Vermont than they ever did before, and the places where that are known worldwide as amazing grape growing, winemaking regions are, suffering year after year after year from climate devastation that may make them not so good for growing grapes and making wine anymore. So it's an area that could sort of provide a shift for folks here.
Well, Heather and I were talking about this a little earlier. Succession planning for family farms is something I'm really interested in. And specifically in Grand Isle County, because we have 3 farmers who own thousands and thousands of acres, and I have no idea what the family succession plan is, and curious how we could work that with the local planning commissions and buying land, or letting them lease land to marginalized groups or marginalized farmers to then farm and lease out, and how would that work? So basically rewarding equity. For forestry, this just came up over the weekend. Grand Isle County is something like 70% ash trees. So we're now trying, and the emerald ash borer has already infiltrated in South Hero. It hasn't come farther north, but how can we position ourselves as an island that's about to lose possibly 70% of its trees to have something in place? So how do we sort of have regenerative forestry, and how do we plan ahead? How are we proactive rather than reacting to the fact that we've lost, hundreds and hundreds of trees? And food for adults. I love universal school meals, but there are lots of adults who are struggling mightily for food, and they live, at least in Grand Isle County, they live on their family farm. They live in their homestead. They're hanging on by a thread because of property taxes. They don't want to leave. We want to keep them there, but they can no longer afford to eat healthy, nutritious food. And how do we ensure, just like we do with universal school meals, how do we make sure that all of our adults who need food are being fed? And that's it.
So we were contacted today by our constituent from Craftsbury regarding the food sovereignty law in Maine and perhaps mimicking something like that in Vermont. I'm going to cover first the request from outside of the room before I talk about mine. And then there's also the Vermont Food Bank, who you said will be visiting soon. They're requesting 3 million, along with Vermont Association of Area Agencies on Aging. I think their food program is also requiring 3 million. In my own concepts that I'm bringing, and would fit really well into your idea, monetizing soil carbon sequestration. So here's something that we can actually measure and perhaps reward farmers for sequestering carbon specifically. And then those same carbon offsets could be sold as credits in the public marketplace to companies that produce carbon. So thereby allowing an income flow into the monetization of soil carbon. Perhaps even creating a cryptocurrency regarding the carbon offsets. I was also thinking that we need new food and agricultural standards and designations. There's been an erosion of the USDA organic standard that a lot of Vermonters have been articulating, specifically around allowing hydroponic into the organic standard. So maybe, a tougher Vermont level organic designation, perhaps even a regenerative designation, and perhaps even a carbon farming designation. I was also considering, actually, this was an idea that came to me from Center for Agricultural Economy in Hardwick, perhaps a bill put forth that would require Vermont government operations to purchase Vermont grown produce before going to any other source. And, this would fit into like prisons, for example, schools. And then revisit this pesticide rule that popped up recently in the news that certain agencies or certain nonprofits were upset by, maybe putting a real pesticide law into place. I think that's it.
Great, thank you.
I don't want to say a lot because I'm still trying to sort out things because I've had phone calls and emails that are pretty wild. One lady had me on the phone for the best part of over 2 hours because I'm polite. But talking about trapping, and trapping is certainly something to be dealt with. I don't know whether we deal with that or not, but she considered it landmines all over the state. And, I want to represent my constituents, but right now I don't. I'm still putting things together. I've always trained myself in life to be a listener and then speak, because there are times in my life when I was younger that I put my foot in my mouth. And, it hurts. But one thing I could say today, well, three things. It's going to be hard to deal with anything until we deal with inflation. Because many of farmers' problems, many of food problems, is that people are more interested in earning money than they are in doing what's right. And that's just one thing. And the other thing is, where we live and what we farm are two of the most important things. where we live, I've always lived in a rural setting. I've lived on 2 farms, I've worked on farms. I grew up in west of Allentown, Pennsylvania, and it was nothing but farms and forest, and it all went away. And once it's gone, you can't restore it. There's a lot of buildings there. There's a lot of, and where we eat, what we eat is so important. And I'd like, me personally, and people I've talked to, restore a way that farmers in Vermont do food so we can eat somehow. And it seems like could be said, not to fault anybody, very far away from that, because you get back to the money thing. We all like to earn money, but we have to use money, but when it comes to where you live and the food you eat and the people you care for, the most important thing is not money. So I don't know how we restore that, but so everybody else can come up with a good idea. That's all I have to say right now.
Thank you. I guess the one thing I will touch on that's my focus is ag education. I think so. I submitted a draft request this morning. Still gonna do some work with it, but for creating a standard, I guess, for what our kids should know coming out of school. In my opinion, food resilience, nutrition, what we're consuming and its effect on the world we live in is just as important, more important than knowing how to read and write or knowing algebra for sure. So that's kind of been my focus, trying to figure out how to create some sort of legislation or standard or culture around forcing culture, I guess, around agriculture. I think just to give that a little background of why I'm passionate about it, I think there's been this shift, maybe an unintentional shift away from ag just because of the way the world's going. I don't know if we're under 1% of the population is involved in some way in agriculture and food production. Everybody used to either 100 years ago, everybody either lived on a farm or had an uncle or cousin or neighbor or something that was involved in food production in some way. Communities were more rural in a lot of ways, growing more food. There was that connection. So we've kind of, in my opinion, it's been this slow, the frog in the water that's been boiling. And we've been moving away from our connection with where our food comes from. And I think one of my favorite quotes that I'll get wrong has to do with what is honored in a country is cultivated there. And I think we've always, whether it's been in government or anything, we always have a tendency to maybe put Band-Aids on things and fix problems from the exterior. And that is, in a sense, the easy way to do it. But I think if we're going to make a real change, whether it has to do with climate change, whether it has to do with values of people and communities, it has to happen with our kids, with the youth, and in the home. And so I think it's really important to start that process and figure out how we can bring nutrition and food and agriculture and climate in to kids early on, so that that's part of something that's really important and in their lives. And so that's where I'm going with that, and hopefully can get something started so I can get other people excited about it and kind of head down. That's my thing.
Thank you. First, I want to say, this is Jed Lipsky, Stowe, how excited following our first meeting, and I won't call it the diversity of this committee, but the expanded mission of this committee and all of the values, broad values that seem to be represented in this room made it very exciting to me. They're complex challenges, they're new challenges. David brings us carbon farming and all the nutritional aspects that under food resiliency and some traditional farming, but it's traditional farming issues are not what this committee seems to be focused on. So I'm not an outlier to that, but I am, as it's turned out, I'm frankly the only lifelong logger in the State House, the only logger or forest products, if you want to call it industry representative in this room from a lifetime of involvement. I am not old-fashioned and nostalgic. I have sought knowledge every day of my life, and I still do, and have chosen to be a leader in my industry for, let's say, the last third of the century. I can't claim to be enlightened in the first 20 years that I logged, although I tried. So with that said, it's a little, trying to be brief and quick, but a little history that may be relative to some folks in this room that don't understand Vermont history as much. But when I started logging, there were 537 sawmills in the state of Vermont, as well as numerous wood products manufacturing. We have well under 20 sawmills left. So if you think of nutrition, it's like a 97% nutrition. As I was driving to Montpelier this morning, my phone rings. It's former deputy commissioner of forest parks and recreation on the phone, Sam Lincoln, calling me, very concerned, very grateful that I'm in the legislature. The week before, I got calls from most recent former commissioner, Mike Snyder, feels that my presence and representation is critical to having a voice or any living understanding in my focus. I'm backtracking. Every focus you've mentioned is meaningful to me. But what I have to give, and if you want to use the word lead on, is a little more forest management, all those collective values. I want to say I was never motivated to run for the House to represent my profession or industry. It was people of my community in Vermont. So with all that said, issues, I'm not going to articulate a 10-point bullets of issues and bills that I would like to advocate for at this point. But there's one gravely concerning issue, and that is, we've experienced this globally and certainly nationally, the notion of false narratives and truth versus untruth. And with whether it's social media or just rebellious rhetoric or trying to sell spots on the internet, or there's a lot of false narratives regarding the negative impacts of forest management. Stowe's the biggest town I ever lived in my life, way bigger than the other Vermont towns or in the Berkshires where I lived, way bigger. But I'm not provincial. I've been in rainforests in Brazil and watched carnage there. I've been in forest operations in Mindanao in the Philippines and watched practices there. So I have garnered a lot of education. I directed a summer conservation school in southern Vermont, in the West River Valley, before many of you or all of you were born, and not quite all of you, but anyway. And so I've been active in conservation efforts my whole life. But there are values, and having been outside of Vermont, I know deforestation, I've seen it. Forest management, as it's practiced in Vermont, that's an inappropriate word and always has been. Clear cutting has benefits and it has impacts, not all good, but there are very active and enlightened foresters that can speak out to where clear cutting does have a place in our forest ecology. I believe that loggers, some by choice, some by force, things like soil sustainability and productivity and water quality and forest management are totally aligned. Wildlife habitat, songbird habitat, recreation, forest products, and a new one in Vermont's the only or the first state Forest Parks Recreation Department to hire a carbon forester, first in the country. That was under Commissioner Snyder. So these are all values that can improve and have improved, particularly water quality and soil sustainability through regulation. They were called best management practices. Now they're AMPs, they're slightly more advanced. But our industry, which is diminishing by the day, gets none of these economic grants or programs or support that traditional agriculture does. Has it been considered a villain or an outlier? I have no idea why, but when I hear some of the things that Vice Chair Heather Supranant mentioned, Esme mentioned, others, loggers are our friends. Believe me, I've done tornado salvage from Western Pennsylvania to all over New England and hurricane damage, and it's dangerous work. Nobody is, we're valued when there's no one else who can do this work, but otherwise we're sort of, we're the underbelly, So I am going to advocate for our profession. We are 75 to 78% forested in the state of Vermont. There are folks that feel that the most immediate and direct tool we have to mitigate climate change is proper management for carbon and sequestration and storage within our forest. And it's a lot more complex than the bigger the tree, the more it sequesters. On the contrary, stop sequestering, it may store some until it starts falling apart. So that's where I'm coming from. And I will reach out to folks within the field of foresters, timber harvesters, and others to get their ideas, as well as farmers, which I have a lot of constituent farmers in my community. And then, frankly, David, come in with real concrete values that I can help bring to our committee.
Thank you.
So now I got to show my age. Been on this committee for 8 years, listening to everybody. There isn't anything I heard today that we haven't discussed at some level, at some time in this committee in my time being here. And they're all valid things. I mean, and one of the things that I'm planning to work on, working on drafting up a bill. We have focused tremendous amount of time over the years on dairy exclusively. And the reality is it's very hard for small dairy farms to survive. And when they go out, their land goes out. And quite often it's up in development. And then we don't have that land, and we're not growing any more land. And so I think, and being in this situation myself, of going on dairy, there really is no help technically or financial to switch to a different commodity. Kind of left out there on your own to figure it out. Of course, the simplest way is just to sell your land, make money or pay off debts or whatever there is. But I'd like to work on trying to create a grant program that would help farms go from, if you're dairy, you don't want to transition over to growing vegetables, something, it takes a whole different line of equipment and expensive equipment. So, I'd like to see us work on a grant, try to create a grant program to help farms transition from one thing to another. Not necessarily to add a new commodity to a successful business, but to be able to help transition. And if we could do that, then I think we could keep more agricultural land and forest land and keep it in production. And that will, help with climate, help with food resilience, help with everything. That's one of the main things that we study. And the other thing is, just to reply to your comment, Working Lands has been instructed to start doing more for forestry grants. I think there has been a few grants awarded for expanding sawmills or stuff like that. It's a couple of years. And all the ideas are important.
Thank you. I was thinking the other day when we were doing introductions that I don't know that our committee looks like Vermont, but we do have a retired conventional dairy farmer, and we have a number of small scale farmers, and now we have a logger, and we've got me, who's none of the above, but not a practitioner of anything that Rural Lands does. I'm also a little hesitant to tip the scales. The chair has a certain amount of power vested in it, and I'm really interested in this committee being able to be a full 11-person committee. If you're not working, if you've got an idea that you want to get in a bill and you're not already working on a bill, never too late to get started. Well, it is too late to get started once we get to a certain time in February. I'm not sure what the deadline is, but it's actually January. Okay, yeah. So you want to be conscious of that, and we will have opportunity to look at ideas that may not necessarily get into a bill, but if you've got something you really want to make sure gets up on the wall, that's the way to do it. So I cut off questioning earlier and thought, great, this is a good debate that we were going to open up. So I want to just make sure that we do have time to ask one another questions, if you have questions about what we've all heard. We also have another guest that came in after we had done introduction. So we just asked everyone to say hello, and I'm not going to go around the table again. But
yeah, no, I actually saw the first bit online, but when you said it was up from 16 to 18, I thought,
excellent. Oh, good.
Justin Johnson, I work at MMR as a lobbyist, but I'm here particularly for Cabot and Agrimark.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Small co-ops.
Yeah. So we had a question that I think maybe you had wanted to ask for some assistance from,
Perhaps I rephrase it though.
yeah, sure, yeah.
And I'm really sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
So you were indicating that, I have to go back in so the payment for ecosystem services, those services, I think at one point you had said that none of those services are new, they're already in existence, but now we would pay people for them essentially. So what are those services specifically?
Okay, no, and also yes. In and of itself, the payment for ecosystem services, those would be payments to the land stewards or the farmers for the services that they're doing for climate change mitigation. The services that they're doing, I think, are still under evaluation of what is the meaning of climate change mitigation. What are those? But the folks would be on the ground supporting that understanding would be the conservation districts.
Okay,
Is that?
I think so. I think yeah.
Okay.
Conservation districts will be coming in at some point. I don't know if we've already booked a time or not, but somebody will come in to just give us an overview of what they do, how they work, and it might be a good time to.
So on the payment for ecosystems, Michael Snyder had done a lot of work on this in the forest sector. New interim commissioner will be carrying that on. And then Brian Patch at the Agency of Ag is also highly involved in this subject. If you want to know more, reach out. And I'm sure that we're gonna be having them in, so.
Yes.
I just wanted to talk to Jed for a second. NRCS, National Resource something, my partner, she's not quite answering me. We went through our state forester, our county forester, which if you don't know, they will come to your land for free and they will walk you through it. And then, so she got really energized and then she got hooked up with NRCS. And they work with people who have over 10 acres and they want to be stewards of their land. They also work with loggers. So there are people who are doing education for folks. So you're not just sort of an island all by yourself. And they are actively working with people who have forested acres that they want to get money out of, that they want to sustainably log, and they want to plan for the future. So there are things out there, and I can show you the information that she got.
It's just a response.
Yeah.
I am only an island in the state house as a logger. I'm well aware
Right,
that
okay.
I work with numerous county foresters, other, Vermont Land Trust has foresters. There's a gazillion consulting foresters as well. And so there are a lot of, I'm well aware, and they are, particularly because of the current use programs that require a graduate forester to implement or stamp a plan. There are a few maybe that are grandfathered, but so it's a very responsibly managed program. There are issues that, quite frankly, many folks are in current use, not because they're true believers of forest management and the values that come from that, but they are primarily enamored with the tax bill that is rather diminished because they're in this program. So any loophole to put off fulfilling the obligation of management plan make them happy, but they're a threat to those of us that depend on working in the forest to make a living. And there are new initiatives. If there's X amount of wetland, you can designate it a forever wild forest current use piece, have all the benefits, but extract yourself from a management program. That's very concerning to the forest products folks. Just, it's an
Oh, that makes sense. But you just said there are negative impacts of forestry, and I just wanted to let you know that the education that we're doing in my household, there's nothing, we're not hearing anything but positive impacts of responsible forestry. So I just.
Yeah, what I'm getting from CAX TV and other protests down at the Green Mountain National Forest, or the lawsuits and injunctions that Forest Parks and Recreation have had to field and fight in Camel's Hump State Forest. It's approximately, give or take, 48,000 acres. In that forest, there are 3,600 that are part of an ongoing management plan that's been ground to a halt due to litigation. And I'm saying that some of the dialogue driving those actions is inaccurate.
Representative Pearl first had his hand up, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the current use thing and put a plug in for maybe seeing if we can get Jill Remick, PBR, in here.
Good
just
idea.
to maybe go over some things to bring everybody up to speed. I've had multiple conversations with her, and I actually am going to reach out again and talk to her because there was some stuff that I think she wanted to. There may be some things that, some updating that maybe we could work on in here that would help on both on their end as far as administratively and on the end of making sure that the right people are in current use and it's working as it should. So I just kind of wanted to mention that.
Good.
I'll reach out.
Yeah, thank you. I had thought that putting a list together of people we could have in. At one point I had her in my head, but never got it onto paper. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say regarding the villainization of foresters, I think that the common person sees what's large and in front of them, and that's what trees are. We see trees, we see elephants, and these are the things we seek out to protect because they're obvious. But the things that are less obvious, the bacteria in the soil, the small pollinators, the systems that are invisible to our eyes, these are maybe more or equally critical.
Right.
Yeah, that's all.
I was just thinking, we're gonna hear so much data and statistics on this committee this year, but one really interesting statistic that stands out is that the average age of a Vermont dairy farmer is about 58, 59. The average age of a Vermont logger is about 58, 59. So
And growing.
it's interesting that this room also sort of, I think, is somehow mirrors that with, you have got great young energy here and a bunch of people with really good experience.
Yeah.
Can Rodney, Representative Graham, I'm sorry. Yeah, I feel like this idea is percolating into my head because what you're talking about is how to help dairy farmers who need to transition to something else. And I feel like that feeds into almost everything all of us touched on.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's got to be a way that we can draft a bill that focuses on that benefits just about everything every single person has talked about today. Because that's the crux of it in a way. If we're going to lose a dairy farm, how do we, in a sense, repurpose it? How do we do the education on that? How do we maybe divide up that land for marginalized farmers for part of it? How do we train that dairy farmer to take a 5-acre swath of land and turn it into a pollinator garden? How can we take that, do the education, and teach people how to do it differently, how to retrain them, and then how to give them the money so that they can do it and they have the tools that they need? And I'm going to go back to what's happening in my house. We just applied for a $10,000 grant through NRCS for our we only have 10 acres it's not enough to put in whatever the current use. We're not doing it for tax savings, but the money is there. And if we can get if we can get $10,000 from an agency that 6 months ago we didn't even know existed, and they're going to help us get rid of the invasives so we can be more adept at handling what's going to happen if the ash borer comes, and we can start really thinking about long-term planning for how are we going to save the forest that we have. and the trees that we have, we've got to be able to do that for our dairy farmers. And I feel like that's such a huge amount of land that gives us a tremendous opportunity to bring a little bit of what everyone is passionate about into that. So anyway, thank you for bringing that up, because I feel like that could be almost an omnibus bill for us. And I just feel like, anyway, thank you. That's what I'm trying to say.
And I don't wanna just limit it to dairy farmers, because there's other commodities that could, you may have been doing, may have been a logger, but you want a tank or land.
Right.
I can go to vegetables or
Because I think we need to
grapes for
value,
or whatever.
yeah, and I think you said it's what we cultivate is what we respect.
Yeah.
And how do we do that? And how do we let people know who are doing the work in ag or in any capacity that we value your experience, and we want to help you with your land, and we want to make sure that your land is being used well, and we're going to help you do that. And I think that we could do something about that.
Anybody else have any questions or anything you thought of you didn't say the first time around the table? Well, I have to say, it's an impressive list of ideas that we've all come up with. So thank you for sharing them. We'll take a break back here at 3. I think, is that right? Yeah. Back here at 3 for the next session. I forgot to say earlier too, when I talked to Rodney about my taking over the chair, he said that there was something that I needed to know if I was going to be chair, and that was that I had to bake cookies and bring them in. I did that. This is a precedent set by my predecessor, I guess. So, and I meant to pass them around after lunch, but they'll be here when we come back. So, and I'm not going to do it every week necessarily. But
Oh, come
Maybe we
on.
should take turns.
we could take
We
turns.
should absolutely take turns.
Do you have takeout?
I did not bring any takeout containers, but if you're,
I'm just kidding. I don't know how to inject this, but I got a legislative email, everybody's phone number, but my phone number is wrong.
yeah, good. Everyone should take a look at that, proof it, make sure that if there are any mistakes, you can send it back to Laura, and then we'll recirculate a final.
Might be a good thing if you're gonna get 2 hours.